Hi, this is Jeff Nyquist with another edition of Friends and Enemies. I'm in the United States. My co-host Alex Benesch is in Germany, and we're going to talk about the left and about the Democratic convention that happened this week. Um, I got a chance to listen to Kamala Harris's speech, her acceptance speech as presidential candidate, and I had a chance to chat with Jimmy from Brooklyn about it a little bit, and he had the same kind of impression I did. So many lies, so many self misrepresentations. Um, it's conscious lying at this point. When you pretend to be a patriot, when you claim you uphold the Constitution, and of course, they predictably she used the word democracy over and over again. The United States is not a democracy. I know this is casually said. We all have said it. I've probably said it before, but it's not really the case. The United States is a republic with representatives. Democracy is only an element. The United States, as I have said, is only a democracy one day out of every 2 years, which is the uh, the the um, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November every other year. So that's when we get to vote. Otherwise, we don't vote in this country. We're not a democracy. The rest of the other 600 or 700 days. Um, so it's and of course the Democrats, having gotten into power, they don't really govern democratically. They kept the border open. They allowed millions, over 10 million people, to immigrate into the United States when the will of the people was the opposite. They initially passed abortion federally through the Supreme Court, through Roe versus Wade, not a democratic process for legalizing abortion at a time when most of the country wouldn't have voted for it. Um, Although now they've conditioned us so that we will accept it. And this conditioning is through education. And I believe we are being educated to be totalitarians, to accept totalitarian government, the authoritarian left. And I think that's what we've got. Um, as they attempted to impose the vaccine on us, they threatened people, they muzzled people for being opposed to being vaccinated forcibly. They forced many people out of the military who weren't willing to take the vaccine. You have a country, Sweden, that didn't do any lockdowns, and they didn't have a higher death rate from COVID than we did. So there's not only authoritarianism, but it's also the kind of authoritarianism that destroys businesses, wastes people's wealth, and sets up structures that are going to degrade the society and take away human dignity. So I just want to start with that. This is what really troubles me about the Democrats. Whatever the faults of the Republicans, we can talk about that some other time. But this is the Democrats, and it's very frightening to me. They scare me. And people who've lived in communist countries under communist rule see a lot of this. And some of those folks have spoken out saying they're really frightened by what they see coming from the Democratic Party. So my co-host Alex Benesch is in Germany. Part of Germany was under totalitarianism. Maybe Alex, you can tell me, do the Democrats scare you?
Well, here's the thing. There's three groups of people that the left is going after, or they want to recruit these people and they want to bring them into their system. And so one group is the evil people, and there's the dysfunctionals, and then there's the normal people, or you could say the normies, right? So with the evil people, right, this has been shown over and over again. In order to have a revolution or to have a authoritarian system, you need some really brutal people. You need some really, really psychopathic, evil people to do certain jobs, right? And even before you have a system, you need some very brutal people to perform the revolution and to do the dirty work of the revolution. So this is why there's always this leftist dog whistling, right? So this is not just a phenomenon that you see on the right sometimes, when somebody is indicating something and he expects a certain section of the audience to get it. But the left is also doing it. So there's really evil people out there masquerading as left.
And
And they're
And
so
by the
angry.
way, they're just not masquerading as left. They're masquerading as idealists with
Yeah,
an
yeah, altruism,
idealistic
sure.
program. Yeah.
Altruism.
So they and this is their alibi for doing some of the things they do, which are quite
Sure, but it's
disturbing.
just they want to torch things, they want to burn things down, and just they want to crack some skulls. This is kind of the evil people group, and there's a lot of dog whistling going on. Then there's the dysfunctional people, and there's all kinds of dysfunctional people, and usually it requires individual effort to become not dysfunctional. And there's also these people also need some degree of help from others to get out of being the dysfunctional. But what the left has been doing is it's kind of a very very dangerous marketing towards dysfunctional people. So it's like moving the goalposts by saying, "Oh, you're not, you haven't failed at being this or that. No, you're actually some other category of human, some other category of person. So you absolutely nailed it. So we just want to accommodate." Basically for your shortcomings and declare your shortcomings to be great qualities. You're a special type of person or something like that. So normally when you're dealing with a dysfunctional person, so this could be drug addiction or even just chronic cannabis, marijuana abuse. This could be all kinds of stuff, certain degrees of mental illness. Usually professionals will say that person has to admit that this person has a problem, and this person has to take part in fixing things and has to make a large degree of effort. But if this person is not really willing to make that effort, it's almost impossible to fix the problem. But the leftist marketing is aimed at these dysfunctional people, saying to them, "You're great. We're going to accommodate you and your way of life. Just support us, and we will support your lifestyle." And of course, that's a lie. They will never actually support these people. And if they don't perform in a future socialist system, they get into trouble, or they don't get any resources because they're not needed. And then we are left with the third group that is being cultivated, that the marketing is directed at, and this is the normal people, the normies. So part of these normal people, they are altruistic. They want to help other people. They want to make an effort to make things better. So of course, there's a bunch of lies telling these normies, this is exactly the program. We're just going to make everything nice. But there's also a lot of regular people who are just regular people who are just too tired, and they're not used to making their own decisions, and they love that marketing, that the system is going to take care of everything. So the system, the state wants to just lessen, or promises to lessen the burden that's on you, to organize your life, to find a job or to maintain a job, or to bargain and get a better wages and insurance and this and that and 1,000 things. So they will tell these people, we're gonna take this burden away from you. So this is kind of the three groups that the left is going after, with some very significant lies. And as we've seen in the Soviet era, they've professionalized lying. So they have what's called the super narratives, or the core lies. Then they have below the super narratives, they have the narratives, and then they have the sub narratives. So for example, a super narrative would be, we're the nice ones. We're just doing this for the good of everything, just the good of everyone. We're the nice guys, and we have this new idea, and we're different, and socialism has always been different, even though it's always just been authoritarianism of the worst kind. And so this is kind of my short introduction into this, and I've got some notes on some fairly new studies, some groundbreaking studies from scientists, and this is confirming what conservatives have been thinking for a long time. This kind of a really terrible psychology that's being used. That the terrible psychology that the left is using, and that many members actually have. So now we have some solid data, we have some solid studies in science, and the big joke is, for the longest time, it's been denied that there's even such a thing as left-wing authoritarianism. Scientists for a long
Hmm.
time have claimed this is authoritarianism is only a phenomenon on the right. So again, this is
Right.
a super narrative. This is a super lie, a master core
Yeah,
lie.
the old Frankfurt School's authoritarian
Exactly.
personality.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was always a conservative person. There's been this the left has tried to appropriate the term democracy to itself, and democracy, the actual system that we have, being told over and over again, it's about democracy and equality. It produces a kind of collective thinking, especially combined with advertising and mass media, where seeking the truth under this kind of regime is problematic. The old, I think it was Joseph Makowicz, the great anti-communist. He wrote The Triumph of Provocation. He's a Polish anti-communist. He said that uh, communism has elevated collectivized human thought to the rank of a symbol, right? So that there's this idea of the consensus, and they use this idea of a consensus, which is collectivized human thought, as somehow science, when it was really individuals standing against the group saying, no, wait a minute, the earth revolves around the sun, and going against what collective learned people had thought previously. Um, and one of the things that's happened is with this democratic thinking, there's been an inclination not to fight left authoritarianism, not to fight communism, but to compete with it. This is what we've done with China
Mm,
economically, compete with it, which is, of course, dangerous because competing is a kind of cooperative game where we are following rules, but they're not. And so there's this tendency of uniformity and one sidedness. So that when you talk about, like I do, talk about the threat from Russia and China, people go, oh, you're exaggerating. Oh, it's not that bad. It's not that dark. And people actually, when you talk about the literature in Russia and the mentality in China, wanting to kill millions of people, wanting to knock down cities, building weapons of mass destruction when we're not doing so, they actually get angry. A friend of mine pointed out this past week a person on Twitter on X who was pointing out some of these things and the hostile comments that he got, just pointing out the danger because people it makes them feel uncomfortable and it's outside this democratic, comfortable, uniform
mm,
consensus that we're all supposed to agree with. And of course, consensus is the lead into this authoritarianism you're talking about, where everyone has to conform to a narrative. We saw this during the pandemic. We see this now with Trump and Russia. I had somebody taunting me on Twitter today that, oh, you have to come clean because Trump is also a Russian puppet. Well, maybe, but they haven't proved it yet. So let's all these accusations they haven't had the, but I've seen the proof of Harris. I've seen the proof of Obama and the Clintons. I've seen what they've done. I've seen their relationships. I've seen the documentation. I've looked at their biographies. It's pretty clear to me who is bad. Okay, maybe everybody's bad, but I have to go with what the information, the evidence I have now. And so, uh, it seems to me that it's all of it is kind of an excuse to go with Harris, to go with the Democrats, to say, oh, they're really defending the country, which in her speech, in her acceptance speech, she wore the American flag. She's patriotic. She's defending
mm,
democracy,
mm.
whatever that is, which is in her communist mind. And I believe she's a communist, or certainly her running mate is. Um, is an authoritarian left system. And then she lies. She's going to fix the border. It's Trump that doesn't want to fix the border. He's being disingenuous, not her. When she's been part of an administration that left the border open, and she was the border czar, though they're denying that she was the border czar. I mean, it's just straight out lies. It's so many lies that I think you were saying to me that it became boring because you know what the lies are. You've
Yeah.
heard them before, and now it's simply mind numbing to listen to them.
Yeah, and also that's been well the reason why so much intelligence resources from the Soviet side, why so much where so much had been spent on subversion and lying. So this is oftentimes surprising to people who are not that familiar with the intelligence world. They used to, or they tended to think that Soviet intelligence, or let's say Soviet communist foreign intelligence, was all about acquiring secrets. That was a significant part of it, but the most, or the one of the strongest parts, was just lying to Western or international audiences, because that's such a powerful tool if you use it in a certain way. And also Western people, especially Western people, they haven't really been trained that well to recognize lies, to become immune to this manipulation. So there's all this fertile ground for these people to get in and to plant the seeds and to grow this disinformation. It's kind of a science in and of
and
itself.
this disinformation, to show that this is communist. Look, the most characteristic feature of the communist system is the total enslavement of the human spirit and the subjection of human thought, of subjection of the intellect. And isn't it strange that we find that intellectuals, the people protecting the intellect or advancing the intellect, have been soft on
Yeah,
communism for more than half a century. I mean, that's not an accident, and people have to
yeah.
account for it.
And
How
it's
did it
so
happen?
paradoxical. It's so paradoxical that a system that claims to bring people together and create this unity and this love for everyone, that exactly these communist systems, they were implementing the strongest sense of paranoia in the population, down to the smallest unit in society, when people couldn't even trust their own family members because anybody could potentially be an informer.
Well,
Either,
if you read George Orwell, you
yeah,
could be ratted on in East Germany and
if
sent to a camp.
yeah, so it's like somebody is overhearing your conversation. Somebody may already be a paid informant, just writing regular reports about suspicious behavior, suspicious talk, or you actually say something to somebody else in confidence, but this other person is so disturbed by your thoughts, just going against the system in any way, even if it's just a slight way. The other person may be so disturbed that this other person actually volunteers to become an informant and rats you out. So this is like the exact opposite of the promise. The promise was everybody works with each other, everybody's just brothers and sisters, and just this collective organism, this collective body. But you could literally trust absolutely no one. I mean, there's so many Stasi files that people have gotten after the fact. So this is something that happened quite a bit when Germany was reunified. And so a lot of these citizens actually received, or they were able to get, their own Stasi file that was assembled over the years. And so there were some halfway dissidents, and there were some people who always ran into trouble. So they get their file, and they get to read it for the first time in their lives. And then that's when they could read these surveillance protocols of describing the most personal aspects of your life. They were listening in on everybody, and they were writing reports on it. And people that you would have never suspected were actually the informants. Your cousin, brother-in-law, this, that, and the other, your wife, your husband.
Your teacher, in this book on
Yeah,
the Stasi that I have here, 1 in 3 teachers in the teaching system were spying on their students and their students' parents. The
yeah.
teachers were using their teaching as a window into the family, into seeing what was going on through the
Yeah,
children.
famously, the teachers, especially these preschool teachers or kindergarten teachers, they would ask
Hmm.
these little children, "Hey, what describe the evening children's program to me that you watch on television?" And so these kids would explain that popular show that was on. It was a very short, popular program, before children went to bed. But there were two versions of it, the communist version and the Western version. And so they were asked these children, hey, describe what you see on television to us, right? And so if the child described the wrong show, then the teacher would know that the family was watching Western television, which was illegal, of course. And they were not watching the Eastern television. So it's just like you get a promise and they're just lying to you from the very first moment, and you will actually get the complete opposite, where you can't trust anything. And obviously we've seen that in socialist countries when even socialists go after socialists. I mean, you can be a diehard socialist if you're not the correct brand of socialist, or you haven't adopted the new phase or the new trend, then you become the enemy. Then they call
Well,
you certain
the
names.
thing is that they have their system of committees. We've discussed this before, and that if you do not follow the party line, the line that's agreed to, you can disagree about things until they've made the decision that we're going to go this way, we're going to take this issue. Once you disagree with that, then suddenly you are a reactionary. You are no longer a progressive. You are standing in the way
Yeah.
of progress.
Yeah, so
That's
it's
how
not
they view it.
so it's not just classic dissidents who were prosecuted. It's not just people who thought completely different. It was leftists eating, just cannibalizing other leftists for some issues. And so there's so I got some notes on some fairly new research, and this is confirming what conservatives have talked about for quite a while. So it's the psychology of left-wing authoritarianism. So the psychological mechanisms of left-wing authoritarianism were for a long time underexplored, which is crazy. Throughout the entire Cold War, we were able to collect massive amounts of data from the USSR and outside the USSR. It was possible to conduct studies based on that material, but that really wasn't done much. The focus since the 1930s and 40s was on right-wing authoritarianism, and it was claimed right-wing authoritarianism was the only authoritarianism. Until very recently, you could not find much research at all about left-wing authoritarianism. Many scientists pretended this left-wing authoritarianism wasn't really a thing in psychology, as if such a thing could not be found. So this is the master lie. This is a super narrative that they are the good ones. It's all about altruism. It's supposedly the exact opposite of authoritarianism.
Yeah, and there's this other thing is that if anybody's against communism, of course, they're very careful. They know communism has a bad name, so they want to call themselves some other name, progressive or even liberal. They take up that word. But it really is this communist movement, of which most people drawn into the movement aren't conscious communists. I have to make that point. It's that it's being directed and manipulated by a communist system that's insinuated itself, the Popular Front system. And one of the things they've done to discredit communism is they pointed to Hitler. Hitler had his anti-communist crusade when he invaded the Soviet Union. So that they put on anti-communist. So they associate anti-communism with fascism or Nazism.
Yeah.
They also then attack McCarthy, and they call it McCarthyism, even though McCarthy didn't do a lot of the things they claim that he did. And then there's the John Birch Society and the conspiracy theory stuff, the people who are really nutty. So they always associate any kind of anti-communism with these less reputable forms of it. And so that way they make it impossible for you to be a rational anti-totalitarian left authoritarian. They make it really difficult.
So for quite a long time, you had the influence of Adorno's work, The Authoritarian Personality, which of course meant the right-wing authoritarian personality. And this was a very insidious piece of work if people actually get to read it, because Adorno was connected to a bunch of other people, and they were connected to more people who worked in the field of psychology, even very early on. This goes back into the 1800s, and so they could have they had kind of a testing ground, or the whole of Germany, for example, to them was a field for experimentation and a field for research, because Germany was very, very conservative for a long time, obviously. And so this is when these early psychologists, they could study the Germans and they could study these families and they could figure out what the bad parts were, or they could find out some bad dynamics, and they would get sort of a knowledge about that, and then they would generalize it all. They would just say, "This is everyone. This evil, dark stuff. This is everywhere and everything, and there's nothing you can't fix it, except of course by having a leftist system and just have completely different personalities, as if you can just change everybody's personality, which is also partially genetic." So, and also these people described the authoritarian personality, meaning right-wing personality, they described it as a disease. So it's not legitimate. It needs to be eradicated,
It's a
obviously.
mental illness.
Yeah, and so this is kind of like when your average or the average leftist has become a radical without even realizing it that much, has become an authoritarian the moment they stop distinguishing between different groups in the conservative and right-wing sphere, because there's so many different people. I mean, you get all kinds of different people. Some of them are, of course, super Nazi and super crazy and super wacko. But the moment these leftists, the moment they stop distinguishing and they just label everything the same way, that's when the left becomes authoritarian itself. So it's always just enemy, enemy, destroy, destroy, destroy. So psychology for a long time was focused on saying or claiming what's wrong with the right, or supposedly wrong with the right. And so by being so, by distorting psychology in that way, by only talking, by only bad mouthing the right, but that's kind of field psychology. That, of course, meant that many conservatives started to hate psychology, because they thought psychology is just babble, and psychology is just they thought psychology is serving the left. But that's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Psychology had been dominated and distorted as a science by the left. Obviously, conservatives need to be involved much more in that field of science. And there's a need to translate this science into a language that non-psychologists can understand. So, for example, we have a fairly recent, very important study. It says people with extreme political views that favor authoritarianism, whether they are on the far left or the far right, have surprisingly similar behaviors and psychological characteristics, a new study finds. The Journal of Personality and Social Psychology published the research by psychologists at Emory University. The first comprehensive look, they call it, the first comprehensive look at left-wing authoritarianism. Thomas Costello, an Emory PhD student of psychology and first author of the study, said the following: "We found that ideology becomes secondary. Psychologically speaking, you're an authoritarian first and an ideologue only as it serves the power structure that you support." And he said, "I found it puzzling that psychology researchers had almost exclusively looked at the concept from the perspective of the far right." So that's Mr. Costello here. So this is kind of one of the new studies.
Yeah, it's very funny is that they developed this concept during the Cold War of national communism, and if nationalism is bad, how can it be good if a communist country engages in it, right? And we see what China is doing with its Greater Han chauvinism, but they when they do anything, it's okay when the communists do it.
It's like there's even kind of there's also a very disturbing element, the very, very disturbing element among the left, which is not being talked about that much, which is like when leftists, for example, are saying that they only want, or the women say they only want very very weak men. So they specifically want to pick men to have children with, men that are not assertive, men that have low testosterone, um, and all these attributes. They want a very very weak man, and this is not just picking a man who has been raised to be weak. It's also a specific set of characteristics, genetics, right? Because not everybody is super high testosterone, right? But so this is kind of creating almost a racial profile, and of course the opposite is what they hate. So if somebody is masculine, if somebody is assertive, and so they do not want to have children with
Yeah, they
strong men.
associate masculinity with this conservative authoritarianism,
Yeah,
is
and
what
also
they do.
and also then
Yeah.
they want to feed their children this vegan diet, and of course there's many studies that tell you how dangerous this can get, especially when it comes to
Mhm.
testosterone, when it comes to muscle building, and when it comes
Right,
to all these
because
kind of
these
things.
foods have estrogens in them.
Exactly, and so it
Yeah.
becomes
Yeah.
sort of and then of course on top of that, then comes the indoctrination of you have no gender, or you can pick your own gender, or you're one of these genders that we suggest to you. And so there's a psychological pressure if a child, to say a boy, if the boy says, no, I want to be a boy, and I want to be a man, and I want to be strong, I want to be assertive, and I want to kick some butt, I want to be strong, I
Yeah,
want to.
well, this messing with male and female, these concepts, they've been messing with concepts. They've been lying about basic ideas for a long time, fudging things. Um, so, uh, so they can actually go to this transgenderism and claiming, denying in a way, they're denying that there's a real masculinity and femininity, and that it's biological and that it's
Yeah.
built in.
Now, of course,
These things
now
these
of
things
course,
are denied.
the Nazis, for example, the Nazis said, no, we want the brawn. We don't want any brains. We only want the brawn. We want the heroes. We want the fighters. So they were glorifying this thing. But at the end of the day, the individual German the individual German person ended up with no control over his own life. So all that control was stripped away from you. From childhood on, you were put into the Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Youth Movement. Then there was some more training, pre-military training. Then there was, of course, military service and some other services. And then you had a very narrow selection of careers to pick from. And
And
ultimately,
you could mobilize the entire manhood to go to
yeah,
war.
and then you were drafted into a war, obviously. So it's like, okay, the marketing was, we want the brawn, we want the brutality, and we want the male dominance and male violence. But you were just being used, and you had no control over your life. Now the left is saying we don't want the brawn, we want the exact opposite. We want these weak men, and of course it ends up in people having absolutely no control whatsoever. And of course the left will always cultivate some men, some brutal men, to be the enforcers, obviously, because they know they need that. And so this is kind of like almost a racial problem, and that's also been talked about in these studies, that there's a racial component to, or a racist, sometimes even a racist component to left-wing authoritarianism.
Yeah, they attack the right for being racist, but yet they have their own version of it, where white people are bad, and they're automatically, because white people are racists, then we can be racist towards white people. But other groups aren't racist, which is ludicrous. It's like
Yeah,
there's every ethnicity, every naturally normal person likes their
yeah.
own family,
And
prefers
what are
their own
yeah,
clan,
and
their
what are
own
the
ethnicity, right? They're more
and
comfortable with that.
and what are the classic racist, some of the classic racist stereotypes? Okay, so like the most uh, uh, you know most important racist cliches. So and you can take all of these cliches, and then you can tell that the left is applying these cliches to their enemy, which is kind of the assertive,
Or
strong,
they're
strong white
imposing
man.
stereotypes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're
So they're
basically
lifting
they're yeah, it's
they're stealing
stereotypes. They're
they're lifting,
imposing
they're
them on our
stealing these
yeah,
stereotypes, and then they apply them to their perceived enemy, which is for
yeah,
example conservative white strong men. So for example,
yeah.
the kind of the classic cliche directed against African Americans, this cliche of being brutal and violent and just incapable of controlling anger and emotions, right? It's like this out of control brawn. This is kind of that cliche. But that cliche has been lifted and adopted by the left and directed against their enemies, right? So to them, a conservative, strong man, especially a white man, is out of
Mhm.
control, brutal, kind of not really a full human being, and has to be domesticated, has to be kept under control like an animal. Eh,
And the opposite, whenever they want to cover their own tracks, like what Russia's doing now, what Russia's done in the past, whenever Soviet Russia, does something bad, they get our intellectuals to attribute it to Russianness.
yeah,
It's not
yeah,
the communists that are doing bad. It's Russia's evil history. It's the Russianness, right? And of course, Russia has this masculine image, of course, as a nation, um, and so they would say that it's not international communism that's the trouble coming out of Russia. It's not the conspiracy of Lenin. It's Russian imperialism, Russian nationalism reasserting itself. This I really object to, because especially with Putin, when people have swallowed this nonsense that Putin is a Russian nationalist, it's not. So they'll take this thing and they'll invert it. So that even when they want to not take blame for what Russia's doing, because the far left, the real communists in the country, they know that Russia's on their side. They know that Russia's still communist, but they're willing to say, "Oh no, that's Russian imperialism. That's not
yeah.
Russian communism. That's not
And
international
also,
communism."
there's
So they're never guilty of anything.
another thing that the left has sort of stolen and adopted and repurposed is the stereotypes, the classic stereotypes and cliches against Jewish people. So what's the classic cliche? And of course, we Germans, we've gone completely nuts with that one. It's kind of like these people are
It's
scheming and greedy, right? But
it's the
that's kind of
Shylock from Shakespeare.
yeah, but they would
Shakespeare's from
sell
The
out
Merchant of
these
Venice.
people would
Shylock.
yeah, these people have no morals. They would sell out anything and sell out everyone for money. But that's exactly the kind of cliche that the left has adopted when the left is talking about their enemies. Kind of an assertive person who is into business, and a person who wants wealth and who wants to build wealth and who wants to make things better for himself and his
Well, they
family.
they have it. It's not an appropriate wealth. They would have you. You're this greedy person who's cheating and oppressing other people who don't have wealth. And it's like
Oh yeah,
even
and
when
you're
you oppose their
exploiting
global
you're
warming,
exploiting
you're
if you have more,
exploiter. Yeah,
if
you're
you make
you're
more,
you're
if you make more money,
yeah,
then it means somebody else must be losing. And this is kind of like
right.
this
You're cheating
parasitic
somebody. Yeah,
cliche that
right.
was
Yeah.
it's almost like the left has increasingly stolen things from the right, repurposed these techniques from the right, and I dare say the left has even learned from the fascists quite a few tricks and techniques, or they just shamelessly copied a bunch of stuff from the fascists. And there's another study that I wanted to mention. It's understanding left-wing authoritarianism, relations to the dark personality traits, altruism, and social justice commitment. This is by Nyquist and Alex Benesch. So it says this: we assume that some leftist political activists do not actually strive for social justice and equality, but rather use political activism to endorse or exercise violence against others to satisfy their own ego-focused needs. So they started with that assumption, and they actually got to prove that assumption with data and solid science. And it says in the past, authoritarianism has been dominantly investigated in individuals with right-wing political ideologies. We assume left-wing authoritarianism to be a tripartite construct comprising of three elements: anti-conventionalism, top-down censorship, and anti-hierarchical aggression. And so they say contemporary empirical studies on the ego-focused correlates of left-wing authoritarianism are comparatively rare. This is what I mentioned before. This hasn't been studied for a long time. People really haven't focused on that for a long time. The existing research, however, points to a relationship between left-wing authoritarianism and ego-focused traits such as narcissism, as well as psychopathy. So they characterize individuals high in narcissistic traits as demonstrating manipulative and exploitative behaviors, indulging in self-perceived entitlement, arrogance, reactive anger, distrust, lack of empathy, and thrill-seeking. Then there's acclaim-seeking, being authoritative, indulging in grandiose fantasies, and demonstrating exhibitionism, and also sometimes experiencing shame, low indifference, and a need for admiration. This is called neurotic narcissism, or some people call them unsuccessful narcissists. So this really describes a significant part of the left movement. So, when you have this sort of entitlement that people think that things should be flowing towards them. They are entitled to have a house. They are entitled to have a car. They're entitled to have this, and they're entitled to have that. So they're entitled to everything. But they don't want to be involved in organizing that sort of stuff, or they have no idea how to actually be profitable enough to afford all of that. Lack of empathy, thrill-seeking, and also sometimes exhibitionism. So this is kind of like the woke clowns when they dress in these ridiculous costumes and they have the piercings and the weird, colorful hair. It's almost like, that's exhibitionism, and it's like, and quite a few of them, they've never felt successful. They've never felt in control. So they are hoping that this collective system of socialism will get them what they actually want, and get that control indirectly because they can't get it directly. So this is something that they were looking for, and they said in a first step, the results of the data analysis showed that left-wing authoritarianism and all its subfacets were predicted by neurotic narcissism. Interestingly, and contrary to our predictions, we did not find any relationship between left-wing authoritarianism and altruism. These results seem to imply that individuals high in left-wing authoritarianism are also individuals with high levels of neurotic narcissism, meaning individuals who strongly care about what others might think of them, who experience high levels of shame and have a strong need for admiration. And it goes on like this. So they're just kind of uncovering all of this now. They're reconstructing that movement, and it's like something you could have analyzed. Of course, it's very similar to what we've seen with fascist movements. It's like they copied everything, and they're just reinforcing this pathological thinking and acting. They're reinforcing that in people. They're rewarding people for it, and they're punishing people if they don't exhibit that behavior.
Yeah, well, and this is what one of the things Jimmy says is today's left is tomorrow's center. Tomorrow's center is the next day's right. We keep moving to the left. Everybody's moving to the left. And Tim Grosclose, who wrote Left Turn, this is a fabulous book because he's a really great political scientist. He does the politimetrics thing right. he created a way of measuring how far to the left you are. And I've mentioned this before. He pointed out that the Republican Congress of the year 2000 was to the left of the Democratic Congress of the year 1979, right?
Yeah.
And so in about a 20-year span, the Republicans moved to the left of where the Democrats had been 20 years before. And he goes through measuring how far to the left people are by their actual voting. Nancy Pelosi being a perfect 100 on the scale of leftism, right? And there wasn't even a conservative that got a perfect zero score. Zero was perfectly conservative. 100 was perfectly socialist. There was I think the lowest. I think it was 6 was the closest to perfect conservative score you could get. But yesterday's communist propaganda is today's mainstream mantra. We see this with the Vice President Harris. Ask yourself how this has happened, whether there's a method in it, whether there's an agency behind it, whether it can happen naturally, and ask yourself whose agency, cui bono, who actually benefits. And I think the communists here, or the true believing progressives here, and leftists and so-called liberals, whatever they happen to think of themselves, who is benefiting? Our country's enemies, the Russians and Chinese, are benefiting from the degradation they bring to our system and to the confusion they bring to our young people and to the populace in general.
Yeah, and also, of course, this is something that has always been something that has been understood by scientists as well. Is that you not only have these true narcissistic people, very mentally ill people, and psychopaths, but that kind of thinking of these people, this thinking can be to a certain degree. This thinking, this pathological thinking, can rub off on other people who are more normal, or even or used to be completely normal. So by packaging it right, by crafting the right amount of lies and the right amount of distortion, you can actually get more people to think in narcissistic terms, or in psychopathic terms. And this is, of course, reflected in these studies. I mean, they say here, for example, a highly narcissistic or psychopathic person may participate in a pro-Black Lives Matter protest, pretending to fight against racism, while actually using such protesting activities to meet their own aggressive motives and thrills, for example, via violent escalations during protests. Further, such individuals might be attracted to pro-Black Lives Matter activism, because this form of activism can provide them with opportunities for positive self-presentation, meaning virtue signaling. So there's all kinds of people who can use stuff for their own ends. So you got the complete psychos, and they just love to burn things down and crack a few skulls. Then you have sort of these schemy opportunists who just say that, well, if I associate with that, that's going to help me with my career, right? Because it looks good and it's trendy right now. And then you get these pragmatists who think that, well, maybe it's going to help move things in the right direction. I know it's kind of misguided, and I know it's partially bad and it's distorted, but I'll just support it because I think in the long run it will make things better overall. So this kind of the pragmatist type thinking. And then, of course, there's the dupes. They just think that, oh, it's a great movement because it sounds great and it's been marketed to me in a certain way, and that's why I like it, and that's kind of the way they support it. But it's just it's just very, very dark what we've all been expecting, and now science is actually showing that this is really true. Then there are findings published in Frontiers in Psychology, based on data collected from more than 8,000 US residents and more than 60,000 individuals from around the world. Quote, I think authoritarianism is bad no matter what political color it wears, said study author Lucien Gideon Conway, a professor of psychology at Grove City College. We asked American participants to identify the number of left-wing authoritarians in their lives, and I was very surprised at the sheer number they identified, Conway told SciPost. I had predicted the average American would identify one or two, and I laughed at a non-academic who predicted closer to 15. But the truth was very much closer to 15 than to 1. In fact, even liberal participants identified on average quite a large number of liberal authoritarians in their lives. So while I was, of course, expecting some left-wing authoritarianism, I was frankly shocked at the sheer numbers that people reported. Oops. So I was like,
Mm-hmm.
scientists didn't even expect that, right? I mean, it's like they were kind of behind the general curve, I think.
Yeah, and the thing is, look, let's look at the supposed authoritarianism of my grandparents' generation. The ethical standards, cultural standards, um, defense of moderation and behavior. Uh, they 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 believed in the benefits of spiritual traditionalism, um, and morality was the key thing. So when I listen to Kamala Harris, her morality is abortion, right? Is a woman's right to choose to have an abortion, and that is it. And Trump is somehow evil because he's causing miscarriages because Roe versus Wade was struck down by the Supreme Court. That is it's disturbing because the idea of, and then she calls herself a feminist. Now she's never had a child herself, but to call yourself a feminist and to be against the primary thing that womanhood is able to do, the greatest, most beautiful thing womanhood can do is produce a child, and to say, let's cut that child off for the sake of that we can be promiscuous and we can have sex with whoever we want so we can have abortions, and enjoy this freedom. It's
Yeah, and couldn't it be
this
that
is
it
yeah,
couldn't
this
yeah,
is hedonism. This isn't
and
morality.
isn't it usually the case that when people get older, they are a bit older, they become more conservative, especially once you have children, everything changes for you because now you're in charge. You have to take care of these living human
Well,
beings, and you
yeah,
have
if
to.
you love your children, you want to protect them. And of course, when you look around, what are the tools for protecting them? You want to give them structures. You
Yeah, so
realize that
but
children need
and
structures,
so it's
right?
like, and like you see, and when you have children, your children grow up, then you also kind of understand that the system, or whatever system is there or being constructed to manage children, nothing can ever replace you as a parent. And so by having children, you become more conservative, and I think this is ultimately a big reason why the left has adopted this stand on abortion, because they just want more of it and more abortion, because they don't want people to turn conservative, and they want to keep the baby rate low. They want to keep the reproductive rate also fairly low, because the lower the baby rate, the more migrants you can bring into the country to fill up the
Well,
ranks and to.
if you're going to have a replacement of Western civilization with a hodgepodge with the Soviet system, look, the Soviet Russian Empire consists of Muslims and Asiatic peoples together with European peoples. It's this giant. It's an empire. It's not really a nation. And if you can make Europe in the image of Russia ethnically, you can then then it requires to be ruled by a kind of authoritarian center, right?
Yeah.
In this case, Moscow. And the same thing with the Chinese empire. These are really empires. They're not really nations. So if they can reduce the United States from a nation to an empire, which is held together by nothing but naked force and fraud, then they have basically spread their system, haven't they?
Yeah, and it says this here. This is about the study. It says it has been revealed that liberals show negative attitudes towards African Americans when they believe they possess conservative attitudes such as religious fundamentalism. Paralleling
Hmm.
work on the unique contribution of right-wing authoritarianism to prejudice, newer work has tied left-wing authoritarianism to group attitudes by revealing that persons high in left-wing authoritarianism are more likely to exhibit the equivalent of modern racism on a scale that targets Christian fundamentalists. In the modern United States, the large majority of African Americans are religious. For example, 77% of African Americans believe that the Bible is the Word of God. Extrapolating from survey data, a cautious estimate of the number of African Americans who believe in the Bible is 30 million persons. 30 million persons. In a similar ways, Jews in the U.S. have historically been the targets of prejudice, and the majority of modern Jewish Americans support the state of Israel, with estimates as high as 90%. Extrapolating from survey data, a cautious estimate of the number of Jewish Americans who support Israel is 4 million persons. Thus, if persons high in left-wing authoritarianism show negative attitudes towards these groups beyond political ideology, this suggests the unique contribution of left-wing authoritarianism to potential prejudice on large groups of persons that have historically been the targets of prejudice. So basically, that means they don't like black people and they don't like Jewish people when these people are conservative. So all of a sudden, all that love is gone. All that nicey dicey stuff is just gone, right? That quick,
Hmm.
that fast.
Yeah, no, that's yeah. No, and of course it's all of a double standard the way they apply things. You have to believe all this hooey if you're on the left, and they want you to believe it. And if you don't believe the consensus hooey, and I learned about this consensus when I was studying in to get a teaching credential. My master teacher was a communist, and she had a whole class on consensus, how that's how you run everything. And of course, she was really teaching the mechanism of democratic centralism. You all debate everything until the people in the leading committee decide, and then everybody, says, "All
Yeah.
right, we're gonna conform." And that is your left authoritarianism. This is the party line. You have to follow it now. This is science, right? Because our system is scientific, and so that's it. It's the end of debate.
So I've tried to get more to the bottom of this, because when you read these studies, it's very technical and it's very methodical, right? And of course, you could even have a better approach than they've been using if you spend more money on it, because if you're just using questionnaires of getting at people, that's not as good as actually understanding a person's life, personality in detail, and just getting to the bottom of it. I mean, there's better diagnostic tools nowadays, but it's really interesting what's been done so far. And when we get to the bottom of it, I think it all boils down to our feeling of control or lack of control, right? And this is kind of how I think all these lies. This is how these lies are constructed. It always has to do with control, the illusion of control, and the lack of control. So you can exercise control by yourself individually, of course, or you can partake in a group. You become a part of a group, and then in that in that group, you then have as a result a certain amount of control and security and that sort of thing. So this is kind of direct control and indirect control. Um, and uh, and of course, the more you let these leftist people run the school system, the more it becomes kind of this dull almost Soviet style. It's
It's
the Soviet
terrible.
style. It's almost a Soviet style of schooling
Well,
because
it
it was so
is
it was
because
boring on purpose in the Soviet
it
Union.
is a Soviet style because what Makovich characterized Soviet style is it's a series of public hoaxes where you are basically just gaslighting everybody. You're saying what's true is but what you're saying is true is false. And you are just lying. You're just gaslighting people. So now in education, you're inverting things. You take a American textbook and Joseph McCarthy's the big villain in the latter half of the American history, right? He's the big bad guy, and Martin Luther King is the hero, the one American who has a holiday, the only single individual who has a holiday named after him, because we don't have a federal holiday after Lincoln or after Washington anymore. We have President's Day, but Martin Luther King gets his own day. So this is part of this underscoring, and of course, the left wants to get Cesar Chavez his own holiday, right? The communists do. The Communist Party in California, for example, wants to make him his own holiday. So they're constantly gaslighting us, giving us their heroes to be our heroes
Yeah.
overall and denigrating our heroes. Nobody wants, people will tell you, don't quote Washington anymore. That bores people. Don't quote Lincoln anymore. That
Yeah.
bores people. We don't have
Yeah, it's like
a common heritage now in our founding fathers and in our great presidents.
yeah, and if you're a child and you get to spend time also at home, right? If you get to if you have contact with your parents can actually teach you some useful stuff. They can teach you just how the world really works. They can teach you how to hunt. They can teach you how to drive a car, in a safe, secluded area. They can teach you all kinds of cool things, and it's interactive. The child is really taking part in these things, and then of course this was something very, very productive in American history when you would show these children what it was like in what the reality was like in a company, in an enterprise. To see the buzz and see how the work is done and see how a hierarchy can work, right? When things actually function and these things are happening, and it's very productive, and you actually make a profit. So this is kind of what an education should be like. Sometimes, of course, you have to sit on a desk and you be focused on something and be quiet, but it's very notable that when the left is running a school system, it's almost like a prison. It's almost like a Stasi prison where they would take the new people and isolate them. So they would have to sit still and quiet, and they couldn't talk to anybody. And they were going nuts very, very quickly. So by using almost a torture light, a light version of torture on these children, it's so dull, it's so boring, just like the Soviet speeches. This was an exercise of power in the Soviet Union when an important person would hold a speech and it was dull, boring, and 4 hours long. It was
Right. Well,
possible to do.
what's interesting about the Soviet speeches though is that if you understood their Aesopian language, it wasn't dull. They were actually giving away information, but to anyone who wasn't in on the method, that it sounded like dull drivel. And so you have to be able to read between and that's why in ideology classes there were these people that all of a sudden perked up and said, oh, this stuff is interesting because they're using deception. They're intentionally making it dull, but there's these code words telling you what they're really doing
Yeah.
if you understand those words. So this was the learning the code language, which is very dull on the surface. This is why when you listen to somebody like the leader of Hungary, he does that. He was educated in doing that. But to your point, it's far more easy to maintain a wrong cause and to support paradoxical opinions to the satisfaction of, people who are kind of numb than to establish a doubtful truth by solid argument, right?
Yeah.
Because it's something like what I've been trying to do is something that's, wait a minute, what Nyquist is saying is doubtful. But wait a minute, there's some solid arguments here. There's some facts. And so they start to get people to doubt reason and to not even be wanting to pay attention to what's being said
Yeah.
when it's really code language for
I
taking
mean,
over the whole society.
when when my daughter when she went to the next school, there's the first four years of basic school, and then you get to decide what type of others next school you actually visit. And there's like the hardest type, the most difficult type, and then there's sort of the middle type, and then there's kind of the easy type of school. And she picked, of course, picked the hardest type of school. And so then she was about 11 and 12 years old, and we looked at the workload which they imposed on these kids, right? Just the sheer volume of it. And it basically it exceeded the standard workday of an adult. So once you go above 40 hours a week, that is above 40 hours a week, which is expected of these children, you're actually demanding more than of an adult. And so the more I looked at the stuff that was being taught in these German schools, they will make these children almost learn off by heart some tidbits from history, while the children understand absolutely nothing of the underlying structures and dynamics. So, for example, when it's about the French Revolution, or when it's about this war or that war or this and that, they don't understand anything just by visiting the school. They can
Because
have a
they're not, you know what, they're not given basic information to allow them to form the context. So they don't go through
yeah.
history and just tell the stories. They have to make it ideological. So they have to, but in order to do that, they sort of deprive the student of the full story, of the
Yeah.
full information.
And it's really cruel because these children, by that age, they understand, if I do this tough style, this hard type of school, and if I do really well, and then if I go to the right university and I work even harder, then I may actually get some control, or more control, over my life, over my future, because then I can select my career, or I have different places I can work in. I have a greater set of options. And maybe they think, if I make solid money, I get even more control over my own life. If they choose a lower ranking type of school, they with these lower ranking schools, they get more free time, so they have more control over their lives. But then they will have less control later on, because their options are limited and they don't get to make much money. It's like a really cruel game. And what you can see is that oftentimes in different families, when you have a leftist school system, and our system has become extremely leftist, these children will then start to rebel outside of school because they're so desperate to feel any sort of control over their lives. So they exercise this control sometimes by excessively playing video games, or maybe excessive shopping, or just bullying other kids, or rebelling against their parents. So this is when these kids sometimes they start to harass their parents because the parents are not saving the climate enough, or the parents are not voting the right thing, or the parents are not saving the animals, or the parents are not doing this, that, and the other. So they need an outlet. They need to feel some sort of control, but then these children do it in the wrong way, and they rebel against their parents in a way that is just stupid, or they rebel against the conventions of society, and they will say, well, capitalism is stupid, republic is stupid, it's all stupid. Maybe if I rebel enough and I get to become a leftist, maybe this will then change the future. So everybody is hoping for more control, and you're being promised more control, but this is the one thing you will never get. With the left and some other systems, you will never get more control over your life, neither directly nor indirectly. This is kind of what this whole system of lies is based on. Then, of course, alcohol and drugs. I mean, when people become chronic, they become chronic smokers of cannabis. They start to rebel, and they're being lazy at work. There's so many videos on TikTok, that video platform. There's so many propaganda videos on TikTok where people say you got to be lazy at your job. You got to be the last one in and the first one out. Work as little as possible and basically scam your employer. Just scam them, just rip them off, basically steal from them, right? Because this is how you take control. This is the underlying message that they're portraying there by actively sabotaging Western capitalism, by sabotaging these corporations, and then of course if you become a member of a union, there's so many ways unions can actually sabotage things, and they promise you more control, right? This is what the unions do, right? So the unions, they will promise you more control, and they may give you a little bit of control, but ultimately, the way these leftist unions are, they destroy productivity, and then they try to destroy the whole system, and that takes away control for the individual person. So you end up with less control at the end of that whole saga.
Well, what education is for, the idea occurs to me that as the intellectual level declines, because this education is an education under decline, people lose interest in ideas and ideas that are forming the basis of our existence, and they become cynical, and they don't really believe in their country anymore, or see the need for it. They don't understand male and female. They don't understand family. They don't understand how every generation has to reproduce itself and what that means. And so, consciousness, the acute understanding, the striving for understanding, is regarded as we don't need that. Oh, that's a waste of time. Let's just have some fun. And so newspapers are dying. People aren't interested in reading. The book publishing, people don't. They go to these blogs. They look at these entertaining memes, but they're not really interested in serious ideas anymore. This is in decline. And great names, like I mentioned before, like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, that really they had wise things, important things to say to us. People aren't interested in what they said. And so there's no longer a shared interest in common objects, in ideas that we can share, that we can make a better country. All that we've got are these awful leftist shibboleths, these lies about this. I mean, the utopian notions that they've got, that they're going to build this brave new world, not realizing that this has been tried before, and it's deadly, and it's destructive. It's going to destroy your economy. It's going to destroy uh, your whole country, and it's going to open it up to invasion and balkanization. They have no clue, because they're literally at that low level now. That's where it's come down to, and they're ready to join the left because their brains have been weakened. Their understanding has been weakened enough so that this is what they've gone for. And they've been told, oh, this is sophisticated stuff. Read this, read Marx. This is sophisticated, when Marx was a swindler, basically. And they can't see it.
Yeah, so and the way this professional lying is constructed, as I mentioned this briefly before, you have the super narratives, the super lies, then you have the lies, and then you have the sub lies. This is kind of how it's structured. And the most important thing is always the super narrative, the super lie. And even if the followers of this stuff, even if the followers don't believe some of the sub narratives or even narratives, as long as they believe the super narrative, they will go along with it because they think, well, at least we're the good guys, right? At least we're the good guys saving everything. So it's okay if our side is lying with that narrative or that sub narrative. That's acceptable. We have to lie because the purpose of us is so good, because they still believe that super narrative. And in the older days, in the Cold War, you had the super narrative, the super lie, that the USSR was really new and different. It was just so good, and they were all about
It
being
it
good and
was the future, right? The USSR was the
anti-authoritarian,
future.
the
Yeah.
opposite of authoritarianism. So that was the super lie, and people were going along with that super narrative, and they were accepting all these other narratives to be false, right? Because, or it's oftentimes because, for example, when people became aware of the gulag system, right, and they got more information because of these Western radio broadcasts right into the Soviet Union, or word of mouth, or leftists in the West were becoming or got confronted with information about the gulag system, they were making excuses, and they were still lying about it because they thought, well, at least my core beliefs are true, right? The super narrative must be true, so I'm okay with lying about the gulags, right? So this is kind of how they've constructed it. And of course, Russia, or the next iteration of Russia, they inherited all this old professional infrastructure for lying, and so they came up with this new super narrative, the new super lie, which was, now we're conservative, now we're Christian, we're conservative, we're the good guys, we're the good ones, we're gonna save the world. And this is kind of the new super lie, super narrative. And even some of these influencers and activists and followers, quite a few of these people, they actually know that Russia is lying. They know that Russia is
When
lying about a
Russia
bunch of
says
things.
it's Christian, when Russian leaders like Putin claim to be a Christian and wears a cross and claims to be nationalists, no, they're not. This is the thing: is to boldly lie and to tell a falsehood straight on. A lot of people are going to believe you because they're going to say, "Oh, well, they wouldn't lie about that. That would be too outrageous. We can't believe they would," but they do.
Yeah,
They
I
do
mean,
lie
so
about it.
I know for a fact that some of these influencers, they know that Russia is lying about Ukraine. They don't really buy that whole thing about Ukraine is really Russia, and the West wanted
Or the
Ukraine
Ukrainians
wanted.
are a bunch of Nazis,
Yeah, they
right?
wanted to attack Mother Russia, so the Russians had to strike first. They don't even believe that, but they still believe the super lie, the super narrative, that these are the good guys, they're conservative and Christian, so we have to accept these lies, as long as we believe that they're still the good ones, the good lies, the good leaders. So this is kind of why they will protect certain lies at all costs, and they will emphasize or spend the most resources on the most important lies, and then they spend less resources on some other lies. And they're constantly monitoring things. Even in Germany, it's been leaked before that there is constant research on what the Germans are believing and how effective the Russian propaganda has been. So they're always, every few months, they do an assessment and they say, have we reached our goals? Can we change these numbers? And this is kind of how they do it. And yeah, so for example, in the Soviets, they created the World Peace Council, right? The World Peace Council, and this was like in the early 1950s. They were cultivating this thing, and they were lying that this was international. They were lying that this was not run by the Soviet intelligence, and they were lying about the Soviets. They were just saying that the United States is evil, and the United States is this horrible empire run by the elders of Zion. So even at that time, they were combining this left hatred, this leftist kind of argument, the left hatred, and they were also combining it back then with traditional conspiracy mythology, even back then. So nowadays, they're doing the same thing. They're still talking to the left, the Russians do. And they're still talking to the conspiracy buffs, and they're combining this thing. So the master lie, the master super narrative is that Vladimir Putin is actually, they claim that Putin is actually fighting the elders of Zion, the most evil Satanist conspirators in the world. that he is the prime warrior against this threat, this Western or Jewish conspiracy. That is
Yeah,
the
it's funny.
mastermind.
There are some anti-Semites that should mention that are actually claiming that Putin is really a secret
Yeah,
Jewish
that too.
tool.
That
So
too.
there's
They,
that too. The anti-Semites have their own factional disagreements, but yeah, no, it's very funny, and I pointed this out. This is a basic. I could hear it in callers on the John Moore show. They would call in and they'd be really angry about the Ukrainian Nazis, and then they would point out that Zelensky was a Jew and that these evil Jewish bankers were doing this. And I thought, wait a minute, they're Nazis and they're evil Jewish bankers. Wait a minute, you're mixing your conspiracy theories,
they
right?
get confused.
They can't be both they can't be Nazi Jewish bankers.
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
doesn't work.
Yeah, yeah. It becomes a farce fairly quickly, of course. And it's like, of course, man. What did had the Russians have the Russians actually delivered some prime evidence, prime proof of this Jewish conspiracy idea? They have not. So they're not really
Well,
giving
that's
these
the thing
Westerners.
about disinformation. Disinformation always it gives you these titillating stories, and you find this on Alex Jones. You have these titillating stories, but nothing's ever proven. And it's sort of like if you believe one, you got to kind of believe them all. And it's always ends up being, well, maybe, well, okay, maybe that's not proved, but it's in principle it's true because look at all these stories, but all of them are just make believe.
Yeah.
None of them, when you
Yeah, so
scratch the
and so
surface,
the
they all
Russians
fall apart.
the
You know,
Russians the Russians have also not really provided anything sensational about the whole 9/11 thing. I mean, don't these conspiracy activists expect that the Russians would give them the greatest proof and the greatest stuff to actually use?
you mean that the Russian Orthodox had a special what was it? It was a church or it was a chapel or something in the building, and they had some relics in there. And just before 9/11, they pulled them all out like they knew it was going to happen.
Yeah, it's like well, they don't the Russians don't want
But
people to.
they got the building. What is it? The building 7 thing, and the towers weren't down. They were brought down by missiles or the planes. There was nobody in the planes, and all of this nonsense that they make it, and it's very convoluted and complicated. But it's like it's an inside job. It's Alex Jones's thesis that the 9/11 is an inside job. Not that what Alexander Litvinenko, who drank the polonium tea and died, said, no, Putin's behind it. Moscow's behind 9/11. It's
Yeah,
behind
and
Al Qaeda.
guess what? What the Russians did? Especially what Putin did right after 9/11. He was increasing his cooperation with these axis of evil countries: North Korea, Iran, and Iraq. So
Iran?
new weapons
Yeah.
deals, nuclear reactor technology for Iran, and help for North Korea's program.
North
This was
Korean
the axis of
weapons,
evil.
nuclear weapons, basically come from Russia, basically.
This was the
Yeah.
axis of evil, and it was such a big win. The whole 9/11 thing was such a big win for the Russians, because they at that time in 2001, the Russia still wanted to be under the radar of most people's
Yeah.
attention. They wanted to do things and then at a later stage become more aggressive and extroverted
Right.
on a
And of
world
course,
stage.
this is exactly what Viktor Suvorov predicted in his book Spetsnaz, where he said there was going to be this period of gray terror where terrorists who apparently had no connection with Russia would engage in this terrorist war, which would divert all of the resources, intelligence and military of the West to this enemy, this terrorist enemy. And of course, he said this terrorist enemy would be controlled, they would be mercenaries controlled by intermediaries.
Yeah.
And that so this whole terror thing was a
And
pre-World War III diversionary
so
effort
I
to
remember that.
strategically divert our preparations.
So I remember that time. This was like the Bush era, really. This was the Bush years,
Mhm.
everybody was talking, especially in Europe. Everybody was talking about America this and America that, America, America. Nobody was paying attention to what the Russians were doing. Just destroying opposition, destroying freedom, taking away people's control, just creating this nightmarish system or recreating this nightmarish system over there. But nobody was looking in the Bush years. Everybody was focused on America. And so this is why it was such a big win for Russia ultimately. And so this became kind of reinforcing that master narrative, the super narrative, that it's always America. Oh, America is the worst. Everything else is better than America. It's the Satan worshipping, Jewish led globalists, blah blah blah. They're as bad as it gets. So anybody else is better, because these guys are 100% evil. You can't top this, so everybody else must be better. And this is kind of how it works.
I was just, somebody linked to Alex Jones thing on my website. I was kind of annoyed, and I watched it, and Alex Jones is going on about all the New World Order, and it sounds pretty good at first until he says, well, the Chinese were given orders by the globalists and they refused to carry them out. So the Chinese are the good guys because they're not following the globalists' orders, right? And it's mind-boggling. So that his Scheuer, his little
he's in
little
prison
shadow
again.
Alex Jones, he had made the statement. He did one show where he said America's the bad guys and Russia and China are the good guys. So this Alex Jones TV thing, this whole thing is, Prison Planet. He's working for our national enemies. He's on their side. I mean, and yet millions of people listen to this guy and think, oh, yeah, the conspiracy, the globalists. No, it's a communist dummy.
And also,
globalism is just a tool of the communists.
Yeah, he's really proud. And Jones, he's really proud when it comes to his Russian connections and how he's been on these Russian shows, Solovyov and Alexander Dugin and all. And he claims that super powerful Russians are listening to the Alex Jones show and they all love him, and so he's very proud of that. But then you get these situations, like for example with the Capitol event, right? Because Jones had some stupid guests on, talking some really stupid stuff on the air, and then of course the people stormed into the Capitol, and so Jones got into trouble because he was always hanging around people like Roger Stone. So if you hang with the wrong sort of people, right, you get yourself into trouble. And so then, of course, you saw the typical whining of Alex Jones. I'm the victim. They're coming after me because I'm so awesome. That's why they come after me. Why didn't your precious Russians warn you about these things? Why didn't your precious Russians give you a warning about not have your employee walk into the Capitol, not have another employee of Jones stand around on the stairs, and even though he was previously arrested or sentenced or whatever, and all these things, all these other things that Alex Jones got in trouble for, and this could be even more trouble with Alex Jones. Why didn't the Russians save his butt? Why didn't they protect him more? And this goes for some of these other activists that constantly get themselves into trouble. Why haven't the Russians really helped you? Why didn't the Russians really give you the perfect material and the perfect evidence of everything, right? It's like, how can this be? They trust them so much. They trust these Russians. They love these Russians, but they're not really getting what they're expecting of these Russians. And the more in trouble these people get, Alex Jones and others, the more trouble they have, the more they become sort of indirectly or directly dependent on Russia. Because now, this was a headline recently, if you want to get a visa to Russia, now you can get one. But you have to, quote, accept the Russian morals and the Russian sort of the Russian way of life. So basically, if you're a right-winger, or you think you're a right-winger, if you've gotten yourself in trouble because of all that Russian propaganda, and you can function anymore, you can't exist anymore in the US. Now you can go to Russia. You're invited to Russia and they will give you a visa. And there
Hmm.
was and that recently there was a raid against Scott Ritter, the former weapons inspector, right?
Oh yeah.
So he got raided, and of course he plays the victim because he was still working with Russia Today, or he was still working with these funky Russians.
He goes to Russia as an arms control inspector, comes back with a wife from who was a Russian citizen, right? I think she was ethnically Georgian, but she was a Russian citizen. So, how do you do that? I mean, how'd they pawn that off on him? And then ever since, he's been like, pushing their line.
Yeah, and
Well,
this
it's
guy
pretty obvious what
and
happened there,
yeah,
isn't
this
it?
guy, when he was a weapons inspector, I mean, his superior later said that, well, it was always with him, it was always about what narrative served him and made him feel more important. So for a while, when he was the quote alpha dog weapons inspector, he was constantly saying there must be more weapons of mass destruction. Not enough is being done against Iraq. So this is bad, and I'm uncovering this bad stuff. But he didn't have really good evidence back then. But later he turned into a peacenik. He turned into one of these
Hmm.
peaceniks, and then it was all about no, there were no weapons of mass destruction. This was all BS from start to finish. So
Hmm.
but he didn't have evidence for that either. He didn't
Yeah,
have
he
clear
becomes
evidence
a
for that
yeah.
either.
No, he certainly doesn't because there's been books written on this, which everybody knew there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. In fact, the Iraqi nuclear weapons project was in bunkers under the Euphrates River, which instead of digging out those bunkers, we just bulldozed over them and buried the entrances. So
Yeah,
we
and
didn't
also
even look.
yeah, and also
And that's
in
Timmerman. Timmerman covers that in his book.
yeah, in one of these wars, actually, I think it was it the 1990 91 war? I think it was. There was such a fear of the Iraqis using anthrax, that the United States
We
tried to figure things out. Can we get a better anthrax vaccine? Can we get it in time? So ultimately, they had to resort to making some serious threats against Iraq. I think even nuclear
Well,
threats.
they actually
If you,
vaccinated all these Canadian, British, and US troops in the second Gulf War,
yeah,
which possibly resulted in the Gulf War illness.
yeah, because if because these calculations had been done, if you have a few pounds or a few kilograms of powderized anthrax, and you have a machine to spread it in through the air, you can kill 200,000 American troops with that
If
stuff.
it's milled
So
correctly, that's the
yeah,
problem. It's got to be milled to 1 to 5 microns, and
and
it's
so
got to
it's
be
like
distributed
and
into
so
the
but
into a cold air mass. Yeah.
but this Ritter guy, this Ritter guy, he tried to be the famous guy. He tried to be the person that everybody wants to talk to, and the person who gets interviewed. And then he was writing
And
books.
they get the people on the right to believe in Scott Ritter, to believe in Alex Jones, to
Yeah,
believe in Tucker Carlson, because there are certain issues they happen to be right about. And
yeah.
so
So
if they're right about that, well, they got to be right about everything, right? They don't
yeah, and
understand
Ritter
the twist, the poison that's in it.
so Ritter created this hero personality about himself, so this myth about himself, but then he gets busted for his chats with this online chats with underage people. So he ends up in prison because he did that more
Yeah,
than
there was a
once,
police officer, I think, was impersonating
impersonating,
online
yeah,
a 14-year
uh,
old, and he was
impersonating.
trying to solicit some kind of inappropriate behavior from
Yeah,
what he
so he
thought
gets
was a 14-year-old.
so he got busted by these undercovers. He went to prison, and then he was complaining that he was no longer a sought after hero. He was broke. He was heavily in debt. And then all of a sudden, he reinvents himself as this incredible Russian propagandist. He's all about Russia, hates Ukraine, makes these insane statements. So, back then he was crying about the Iraq war, but now he's not crying about Putin's war. Putin's war against Ukraine. How does that happen? Oh, but he still wants to be the hero. He still wants to, pretend that the master narrative, the super narrative, is true.
Well, of course, he keeps saying that Russia's winning the war, just like Douglas McGregor. This narrative that Russia's winning the war in Ukraine, and we can see that's not happening right now. We see the Russians are back on their heels again. So this is just not real. Anyway, I've got to go, so we've got to end the show now. I think we've covered the topic pretty well. The lies of the left and how people believe in this left authoritarianism. Any final comment, Alex, on this?
Well, I would strongly recommend that people get more, especially conservative people, get more into psychology, because it's been dominated for so long by the left. And I remember I was getting sometimes I would be getting comments from people saying, don't psychoanalyze this, don't psychobabble. I don't like any psychological explanations. They really hate it because it's been dominated by the left and it's been distorted by the left. But don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You just have to start using it for yourself. And this is also something that's very, very common in the intelligence world, because in the intelligence world, you have to understand people's motivations, people's goals. You have to be able to look through people's deceptions. So you have to understand your own mind, so you don't get a distorted view on things. So do you have a bias? How did I grow up? What is my relationship with control? How much control did I have over the course of my life? Does that make me vulnerable to a specific type or style of propaganda? So we need to use these tools, and we cannot just abandon these tools because we just never really got into it because it was used by the left for so long. So there's some good stuff out there on psychopathology and some other aspects of it. Sometimes even you get books dealing with psychology and politics, but this combination is really underdeveloped. So oftentimes you have to make up your own mind, and then you can actually surpass what's being published so far, because a lot of these scientists, they're really sterile and they're all about crunching numbers, and sometimes the diagnostic tools are not good enough. So if you're smart
Hmm.
about it, you can actually go beyond that stuff that's out there, and and just have more analytical thinking, or think like an analyst. Don't think like an activist. Standard activist thinking is a very big problem.
It's acting, not thinking. It's doing rather than thinking. Anyway, thank you for that, Alex. I'm Jeff Nyquist. This has been Friends and Enemies. My co host, Alex Benesch, and we thank you for being with us. We hope you will join us next week for another discussion.